Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The room was dressed in soft pastel colors, like a scene pulled straight out of a magazine ad that wanted to sell the idea of joy. Pink and blue streamers floated from the ceiling, baby-themed cupcakes sat neatly on white doilies, and a mountain of brightly wrapped gifts was piled near the window where sunlight poured in, casting a golden sheen over the ribbons and bows. There was laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of overly sweet small talk that came with family gatherings, everyone pretending to like each other just enough to get through the afternoon without a scene. I smiled at the people I'd known my whole life, letting them fuss over my belly, touch my hand, ask the same tired questions. When's the due date? Have you picked a name? Do you know if it's a boy or a girl? And for a while, I let myself feel like maybe this moment was mine. Maybe this was one of those rare slices of life where you feel like you're actually part of something good, like you belong. But then, of course, she had to ruin it. Ruth. My aunt, my mother's sister, the unofficial queen of backhanded compliments and whispered judgments wrapped in fake concern. She sat across the room, all pearls and perfume, with that smug half-smile she wore like a badge of honor. I watched her lean toward my cousin Hannah, who had been nibbling on a cookie, and even though she tried to keep her voice low, the room was just quiet enough, and my ears were just sharp enough to catch every single word. "She doesn't deserve all these gifts," she said, her voice curling with disdain like cigarette smoke. Claire would have been a far better mother. We all know that. Hannah didn't say anything. She just sort of nodded politely and looked down at her plate, probably hoping she could disappear into it. Maybe she agreed. Maybe she didn't. Honestly, I didn't care. All I could hear was Ruth's voice echoing through my skull like it was bouncing off the inside of a cave. It wasn't even the words, though God knows they hurt, it was the tone. That certainty, like it was a fact, not an opinion. Like everyone in the room already agreed with her but was too polite to say it out loud. I didn't react. Not outwardly, anyway. I smiled through the next toast, thanked someone for a diaper cake shaped like a giraffe, and nodded my head while my friend Monica talked about stretch mark cream. But inside me, something was splintering. Not cracking, splintering. Small, sharp shards of old pain and buried resentment breaking loose from the place I'd locked them up years ago. I thought I had made peace with the fact that I wasn't the favorite. I thought I'd buried my childhood in a deep enough grave that it couldn't crawl back out. But Ruth's whisper brought it all back like a damn resurrection. She had always made it clear, Claire was the golden one. The daughter everyone wanted, the one with the perfect GPA, the glowing skin, the sparkling engagement ring from some hedge fund guy whose name I couldn't remember. And me? I was the one who dropped out of college for a while, the one who got knocked up by a man who disappeared faster than he came, the one who never quite fulfilled her potential, as Ruth liked to put it. I didn't get the same kind of love, not from her, not from most of them. My baby shower was the first time anyone in the family had celebrated something for me without looking like it was out of obligation. And now even this one little day wasn't mine. I kept glancing at Ruth from across the room. She was sipping her mimosa with that same smug grin like she'd just dropped a truth bomb and was waiting for the dust to settle. Claire wasn't there. She was on some vacation in Napa with her husband, but somehow, Ruth had managed to make her presence felt anyway. It was like a ghost hovering behind every sentence, every conversation. The comparison, the judgment, the unspoken hierarchy of who's better, who's worthy, who deserves what. And the worst part? No one said a damn thing. No one stood up for me. Not my mother, not my cousins, not even the friend who was closest to me. They just kept chatting, drinking, passing around little plates of finger food like it was just another sunny Saturday. I sat down for the final round of gifts, my hands resting on my stomach, my smile fixed in place like a goddamn mannequin. Someone handed me a tiny baby onesie with a little duck printed on the front. I held it up, said how adorable it was, but inside, my blood was simmering. That whisper kept circling back, looping in my head like a song you hate but can't turn off. She doesn't deserve these gifts. Claire would have been a better mother. I wondered how long she'd felt that way. Years? Decades? Did she whisper that to my grandmother too? Did she say that when I was 5 and scraped my knee, when I got my first B on a math test, when I cried at my high school graduation because I didn't want to leave town? The party started winding down, people gathered their coats, and Ruth raised her glass for one last toast. To Emily, she said, with that syrupy voice that made my skin crawl. And to the baby, may he or she grow up strong and smart, maybe even like their Aunt Claire. Everyone laughed politely. I didn't. Something inside me went still, calm, cold, and razor-sharp. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was going to make her eat those words. And when the lawyer read that a few weeks later, I swear to God, I saw her smug little world collapse in a single breath. There's something about family wounds that never fully scab over, no matter how much time passes or how many smiles you force your face to wear through holidays, birthdays, and awkward backyard barbecues where the air always feels a little too tight with judgment. I used to think I could outrun it all, bury the past under a pile of distractions, drown it in work or wine or weekends with friends who didn't know the twisted dynamics that shaped me, but the truth is, it always finds a way back. Sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a look, and sometimes in a single sentence that shatters everything you've spent years pretending didn't matter. After that baby shower, I couldn't stop hearing Ruth's words. I tried to shake it off like it was just another petty jab, another bitter old woman's opinion that didn't deserve space in my head. But deep down, it wasn't just about that one comment, it was about everything that led up to it. Because Ruth hadn't just spoken her own opinion in that moment, she'd spoken a family truth, one that had been carved into me from the time I was old enough to understand what favoritism felt like. Claire was always the golden child, and I mean that literally. Her hair shone like sunlight in every childhood photo, her smile perfect even in those awkward preteen years, while I looked like the kid who never quite knew where to stand. Claire was the one who got the praise, the applause, the extra scoop of ice cream just for finishing her homework on time. I was the one with messy handwriting, forgotten permission slips, and a knack for saying the wrong thing at every dinner table conversation. Ruth adored her. Obsessed over her, really. From the moment Claire learned to tie her shoes early, Ruth declared she'd be a doctor or a lawyer, or something else that screamed success loud enough to echo through the neighborhood. Me? I was the one Ruth said needed structure. The one who was creative but lacked direction. I remember once, when I was maybe 9 or 10, Ruth said I was the kind of girl who'd lose her own head if it weren't attached to her shoulders. Everyone laughed. I didn't. The pattern never changed, even as we got older. Claire was valedictorian, of course. I scraped through my classes with just enough effort to stay unnoticed. Claire went off to some big-name university, graduated early, and married a man who wore $1,000 suits and shook hands like he owned the world. I moved back home after college burnout, worked part-time at a bookstore, and fell in love with a man who disappeared the minute I told him I was pregnant. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious if it was printed in bold letters on a damn family newsletter. Ruth, of course, never let me forget it. She never said it outright, not until that whisper at the baby shower, but her judgment was everywhere. In the way she pursed her lips when I mentioned work. In the way she asked if I was managing to stay afloat financially. In the way she only ever called me when she needed something, never to ask how I was, but always to ask if I could help clean out grandma's garage, or pick up dry cleaning, or babysit someone's kid while Claire and her husband attended some charity gala. And yet, despite all that, despite every bruise she never bothered to hide, I still wanted her to see me. Isn't that the most pathetic part of all? That I still craved her approval like some starving kid reaching out for scraps from a table I was never invited to sit at? Tell me something honestly, have you ever had a family member say something so cruel it echoed for years? Something so subtle, but so damn sharp, it changed how you saw yourself forever? Have you ever smiled through it, played nice, told yourself it didn't matter, only to realize later that it changed you in ways you didn't even notice until you were grown and broken in ways you couldn't explain? I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because it's the truth, and I'm tired of editing myself for the comfort of people who never gave a damn about mine. Claire had everything. The respect, The praise, the husband, the money, and maybe most of all, the assumption that she was good, pure, responsible, destined for greatness, while I was the cautionary tale. The warning sign. The one whose life was always a little too messy, a little too loud, a little too flawed. That's what made Ruth's whisper burn so deeply. Not because it was shocking, but because it wasn't. It was just the final sentence in a story that had been written years before I ever knew how to hold a pen. A week after the baby shower, I got the call. Grandma had passed in her sleep. Peaceful, they said. No pain. Just gone, like a whisper. We were all expected at the house for the reading of the will. No details were given. Just a date, a time, and that heavy, ominous silence that always comes before a storm. I stared at my phone after the call ended, feeling something shift in my chest, not grief, not yet, but something else. A tension. A current. Like maybe this story wasn't finished after all. And somehow I knew, deep down, I was about to find out just how many secrets my family had buried beneath those manicured smiles and clean kitchen counters. Something was coming. Something big. And Ruth had no idea it was about to hit her like a freight train. The house hadn't changed in decades, and walking into it felt like stepping backward in time, like every creaking floorboard carried a memory that didn't want to be forgotten. The wallpaper was still that same yellowish floral print from the 70s, curling slightly at the corners where humidity had slowly done its quiet damage. The living room smelled faintly of mothballs and dust, with undertones of lavender potpourri that had long since lost its charm. Plastic still covered the furniture, rigid and cold beneath your fingers, as if no one had dared to sit down since the Reagan administration. And the walls were lined with framed photographs, each one a time capsule of carefully curated smiles and rigid family poses, the kind of pictures where you could almost hear Ruth's voice coaching everyone to stand taller, smile wider, pretend harder. I had been here 1,000 times before, yet somehow the house felt heavier now, like it knew something was about to shift beneath its foundation. My grandmother was gone, and her absence clung to the air like a second layer of dust. There was no scent of her perfume anymore, no sound of her slippers brushing across the linoleum, no rustle of her knitting needles tapping together in the kitchen. Just silence, and the weight of a legacy none of us understood yet. Everyone was gathered in the front parlor, the one with the lace curtains and the old piano no one had played in years. Cousins, uncles, great-aunts, second cousins twice removed. Most of them had only shown up for the reading of the will, pretending to mourn with plastic sympathy while their eyes flicked toward the antique cabinets and gold-framed mirrors they secretly hoped to claim. Ruth arrived in her usual dramatic fashion, draped in a black shawl and clicking her heels across the hardwood like she was walking into a courtroom, not a house full of grief. Claire followed her, perfectly put together as always, hair curled just enough to look effortless, makeup precise, and a designer handbag hanging off her arm like a damn trophy. They didn't say much to me when they arrived, just a cool nod from Claire and a performative hug from Ruth that smelled like expensive hairspray and hollow intentions. She glanced around the room and smirked at the furniture like she was already mentally redecorating. "Well," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I suppose Emily will end up with the old cat and maybe one of those dusty photo albums if she's lucky." A few people chuckled nervously, but most avoided eye contact, probably wondering if Ruth had finally taken it too far. I said nothing, but my fists clenched so tight in my lap that my knuckles turned white. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the old cat had died 2 years ago. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the assumption, the same old damn assumption they'd all carried for years, that I was the background character in their perfect family story, the one who should be grateful for scraps and stay quiet while the real stars took the stage. The lawyer arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, a gray-suited man with thinning hair and a voice that sounded like it had read one too many dry documents. He greeted everyone politely, took his place near the mantel, and opened a thick folder that looked older than some of the guests in the room. The murmurs died down as he cleared his throat and began reading the will in that slow, measured tone that made every sentence feel like a sermon. It started with the expected, expressions of gratitude, a few charitable donations, some minor heirlooms gifted to distant cousins who barely remembered Grandma's name. Ruth sat there with her legs crossed and her chin slightly lifted, already picturing herself walking out of the house with the deed in one hand and the antique silverware in the other. Claire had that faint smile, the kind people wear when they're pretending to be humble but already counting the money in their heads. But then everything shifted. The lawyer reached the final section of the will, his tone becoming more deliberate as he adjusted his glasses and looked down at the page in front of him. As per the last amendment to this document, he said, all remaining assets, including the family home, financial accounts, and all remaining property and heirlooms, are to be transferred in their entirety to, he paused here. And the room leaned forward collectively, breath held like a choir of vultures awaiting their feast, the future mother of my great-grandchild. Silence hit the room like a slap. You could hear someone's fork clatter against their teacup. I saw Claire's expression twitch first, just a fraction of a second where her composure cracked and panic surged beneath the surface. Ruth turned toward the lawyer so fast her earring swung and tapped her neck. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What kind of nonsense is that?" But the lawyer didn't even flinch. He simply adjusted the papers again and repeated it slowly, with the kind of certainty that couldn't be challenged. The entire estate is to be passed on to the future mother of their great-grandchild, as outlined in the legally signed and notarized amendment dated 8 weeks prior to Mrs. Harriet Sutton's passing. Everyone's eyes turned toward Claire first, of course they did, because they always assumed she was the chosen one. But Claire just sat there, frozen, color draining from her cheeks. Then, slowly, all eyes shifted toward me. And the lawyer, without a trace of hesitation, turned his gaze toward me and gave a small, quiet nod. That moment lasted forever. You could feel the room recalibrating around it, like a sudden change in gravity that left everyone dizzy and stunned. Ruth's mouth opened, then closed again, her expression curdling into something between confusion and rage. Claire looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The silence said it all. Because for the first time in my entire life, the room wasn't looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with something that felt a lot like fear. The thing about explosions is that they never start loud. First, there's a moment of total stillness, so thick and tight you can feel it in your teeth, and then it hits like thunder across dry earth, tearing through every corner of the room. That was exactly how it felt in that old parlor after the lawyer's final words hung in the air, still echoing somewhere behind the ticking of the grandfather clock. Ruth's silence lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal. Her face twisted, contorted into something feral, like a mask had slipped and underneath was all the venom she had kept stored for decades, just waiting for the right moment to spill. "What kind of manipulative little stunt is this?" she snapped, her voice slicing through the room like a cracked whip. She stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled over behind her, and I watched her hands shake, not from grief, not from shock, but from pure rage. She got pregnant just to take everything. You think this is a coincidence? You think it's an accident she suddenly has a baby in her belly right when my mother is revising her will? She wasn't even looking at me anymore. She was shouting at the lawyer, at the walls, at anyone who'd listen, as if sheer volume could erase what had just been said. Claire, still seated beside her, covered her mouth with one hand and let out a soft sob that was so perfectly timed, I almost wondered if it was rehearsed. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice cracking like a fragile ornament on tile. "She's always been reckless, always making messes for the rest of us to clean up. Why would Grandma do this? Why would she leave it all to her?" Claire looked around the room, searching for agreement, some sympathetic nods, some confirmation that this was all a mistake, but no one said a word. The silence was thick with discomfort and unspoken truths, and no one dared break it. And still, I hadn't moved. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the scene unfold like I wasn't even part of it. There was a calm growing inside me that didn't belong to logic. It was something deeper, something primal, like finally finding a room that fits you after a lifetime of squeezing yourself into spaces that didn't want you. I had always wondered what vindication would feel like, and now that it was here, it didn't feel like a victory parade. It felt like quiet justice, heavy and certain. The lawyer, to his credit, remained completely unfazed. He simply reached into his folder, pulled out a copy of the notarized amendment, and held it up. The clause was added legally, he said firmly, his voice cutting through Ruth's ranting like a blade. Your mother signed it in my presence, along with 2 witnesses. She was of sound mind and very clear in her intentions. The language in this will was hers, not mine. She wanted the estate to go to the future mother of her great-grandchild. Not the best-behaved niece. Not the wealthiest. Not the most admired. The future mother. That's the only condition she cared about. Ruth sputtered something under her breath, something about manipulation, about betrayal, about legacies stolen by liars, but her voice had lost its power. Her fury was unraveling, thread by thread, and beneath it all, I could see it finally, the fear. Not just fear of losing the money or the house, but fear of losing control. Because that's what Ruth had always been addicted to, not love, not legacy, not family, but control. And now she'd lost it, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do to claw it back. The rest of the family murmured in hushed tones as the room began to empty out, people pretending to have errands or obligations, anything to excuse themselves from the awkwardness now hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. No one wanted to linger too long under Ruth's burning glare, and frankly, neither did I. The lawyer gathered his papers, shook my hand gently, and before leaving, handed me a small envelope and a brass key, both of which felt strangely heavier than they should have been. This, he said quietly, was left for you. She told me to give it to you after everyone else was gone. I nodded, fingers trembling slightly as I took the items. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp I recognized from Grandma's writing desk. On the front, in her graceful, looping cursive, were 5 simple words, open after they all leave. I held it in my palm as the house emptied out, one by one, the clatter of shoes and muttered frustrations fading into the distance. I didn't open the letter right away. I just sat in the quiet for a while, listening to the house breathe again, listening to the silence she had left me, a silence that somehow spoke louder than all the screaming ever could. And deep down I knew. This letter wasn't just another goodbye. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The envelope felt heavier in my hands than it had any right to be, as if the weight of everything unspoken between my grandmother and me had been pressed into the parchment like invisible ink, waiting for just the right moment to be revealed. I sat there for a long while, staring at her looping cursive on the front, those 5 carefully written words, open after they all leave, and even though the house had already fallen quiet, I hesitated to break the seal. It felt like crossing a threshold I couldn't come back from, like cracking open a door to something that had been buried under decades of silence and carefully controlled smiles. But eventually, my fingers moved on their own, breaking the wax with a soft snap and unfolding the thick paper that smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender and something older, something familiar I couldn't quite name. Her handwriting filled the page, deliberate and graceful, every curve of every letter echoing her voice in my mind. I started to read, and within the first few lines, I knew this wasn't going to be the kind of letter people write just to say goodbye. It was a confession, a reckoning, and a release all wrapped into one. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The very first sentence struck me like a punch to the chest. Emily, I should have spoken these words out loud a long time ago, but I was afraid. And I was wrong. I swallowed hard and kept reading, each sentence digging deeper into the marrow of everything I had ever suspected but never dared to speak aloud. She wrote about how she had watched me, year after year, slowly become the shadow in a family that was supposed to protect me. She admitted she had seen the way Ruth manipulated conversations, twisted narratives, painted Claire as the perfect daughter and me as the cautionary tale. And she hadn't just noticed it in passing, she had known. She had seen it happening and stayed silent, afraid of upsetting the delicate balance of power that Ruth had constructed around herself like a fortress made of passive-aggressive remarks and perfectly timed guilt trips. But the part that made my stomach turn was what came next. She wrote that Claire had always been Ruth's prize, the perfect vessel through which Ruth tried to relive her own ambitions, the shining beacon she believed would carry their bloodline forward in the way she saw fit. What almost no one knew, what only a few quiet whispers in the family had ever dared to suggest, was that Claire couldn't have children. It wasn't public knowledge, not even widely known among relatives, but my grandmother had known the truth for years. Claire had undergone surgery in her 20s that had left her unable to carry a child, and though Ruth had spun it as a minor procedure, a temporary condition, the truth was permanent and irrevocable. And that's when it all clicked together inside me like the final pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. My pregnancy hadn't just been a surprise, it had been a threat. A threat to Ruth's fantasy, to the carefully constructed illusion that Claire was still the heir apparent, the one who deserved everything simply because Ruth had always said so. If my child existed, if I gave birth and stood in that living room as the mother of my grandmother's first great-grandchild, then all of Ruth's control would evaporate, just like it did in that will reading. And worse than that, Ruth had known too. Somehow, someway, she had figured out that my pregnancy meant everything could shift in an instant, and she had resented me for it more than I could have imagined. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't petty bitterness. This was cold, calculated strategy, a campaign to destroy the one variable that could ruin the illusion she had spent decades maintaining. Ruth hadn't just wanted me to fail. She had needed me to fail. And I began to see every moment in a new light. Every fake smile, every cutting remark, every time she offered me wine with a raised brow and just a sip won't hurt, every subtle dig wrapped in concern, every little attempt to make me doubt myself, stress myself, push me to the brink. I sat back on the old couch, letter trembling in my hands, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the silence anymore. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about power, about legacy, about the lengths people will go to protect a throne that was never really theirs. And suddenly, I realized something with a clarity that scared me. Ruth had spent her whole life trying to make me feel invisible, like I didn't matter, like I was an afterthought in my own family's story. But now? Now it was my turn to make her feel that same emptiness. She had built her entire identity on control, on always being at the center of everything, on being the one whose opinion mattered, whose approval everyone sought. So if I really wanted revenge, real, soul-cracking revenge, it didn't have to be loud. It didn't need fireworks or screaming matches or public confrontations. It only needed silence. Calculated silence. Dignified silence. The kind that echoes longer than any scream ever could. I folded the letter carefully, smoothed its edges with my palms, and tucked it into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against the brass key still resting there, the key to a house that was no longer hers, no longer theirs, no longer ruled by whispered judgments and bitter smiles. And in that moment, I made my decision. If Ruth wanted to know what it felt like to be forgotten, to be dismissed, to be erased without anyone raising their voice or shedding a tear, then I would give her that experience, one quiet, brutal step at a time. I would not confront her. I would not argue. I would not scream. I would make her disappear, exactly the way she tried to make me vanish for most of my life. Revenge doesn't always come with fire and fury, with screaming matches in crowded rooms or dramatic confrontations that leave people gasping at doorways. It's quieter than that, colder even. And far more satisfying when it slips in unnoticed and takes its time. I didn't march into Ruth's house with demands or throw her hypocrisy in her face with righteous fury, because the truth is, people like her don't respond to volume. They thrive on chaos, feed on outrage, twist it into something that makes them the victim. But silence? Silence eats them alive. Silence forces them to sit in their own irrelevance, watching as the world slowly forgets they were ever central to the story in the first place. I began with the house, not for show, not for vengeance, but because I needed to reclaim something sacred, something real. I walked through those creaking hallways not as the girl they ignored, but as the woman they underestimated. The first thing I did was strip down the old furniture Ruth always bragged about, the heavy oak sideboard she used to polish like it was her own crown jewel, the antique chairs with needlepoint cushions she'd protected like national treasures. I didn't sell them quietly either. I listed them publicly, attached little stories to each one like marketing hooks. Estate sale, items from the home of Harriet Sutton, proceeds support local single mothers. I knew Ruth would see it, and I wanted her to. I wanted her to feel it in her bones. Then came the heirlooms. The china set she once said would be Claire's one day, the crystal glasses she only brought out when certain names were on the guest list, the old grandfather clock she used to call the heartbeat of our home. Gone. All of it. I didn't pawn them or hide them away, I donated them. I boxed them up and delivered them to charity drives, women's shelters, transitional homes. Places Ruth would never step foot in, places she would scoff at from behind her wine glass. I stood there in those lobbies, stomach round beneath my coat, hands steady as I handed over the last pieces of her legacy. And each time, it felt like I was peeling off another layer of her influence from my skin. But the real revenge, the kind that stings without leaving a mark, was in the updates. Every week, like clockwork, I posted cheerful messages in the family group chat. Pictures of fresh paint in the living room, soft yellow replacing the cold beige Ruth always insisted was elegant. Photos of the nursery I was building, where Grandma's sewing room used to be, now filled with color and warmth and light. Updates about how I was partnering with a local nonprofit to start a program supporting single mothers in need. In Grandma's memory, I would write beneath each post, followed by a little heart, knowing full well Ruth would see it and choke on her morning tea. I never mentioned her by name. I never mocked her directly. I didn't need to. The silence did it for me. The absence of her influence, the lack of space she held in the new chapter of this home, was louder than anything I could have said. She responded once, just once, with a single thumbs-up emoji and a passive-aggressive comment about how some traditions shouldn't be discarded so easily. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The final piece of the puzzle arrived one quiet evening, when the sun was sinking behind the trees and the wind carried that slow, shifting rustle that made everything feel a little softer, a little slower. I sat on the front porch in the old rocking chair Grandma used to love, the one no one else wanted because the paint was chipped and the cushion worn thin. I rocked slowly, hand resting on the curve of my belly, watching the sky shift from gold to lavender, and in my lap was another envelope, one I hadn't opened until now. Inside was a shorter letter, this one scrawled in Grandma's later handwriting, shakier, but still unmistakably hers. She wrote only a few lines, but they settled into my bones like warm water in winter. Emily, sometimes justice doesn't need a bang. Sometimes it only takes a whisper at the right moment to echo forever. I folded the letter and placed it on the small table beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, letting her words settle into the silence that surrounded me, the same silence that used to make me feel small now stretched out like a cloak over everything I had reclaimed. Maybe I didn't win anything in the way people expect when they talk about revenge. I didn't scream, I didn't destroy, I didn't demand an apology that would have been insincere anyway. I just erased her, piece by piece, from the story she once thought she owned. And somehow, that felt like the most fitting justice of all. So tell me something, honestly, was I cruel? Or did I just finish a fight that started before I was even born? Was it petty to gut her legacy and fill its shell with something better, something real? Or was it necessary? Was it the only way to break the cycle and finally set the story right? I don't know the answer. Maybe I never will. But as the wind rustled through the trees and my child kicked gently beneath my ribs, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The house was finally quiet. And the silence never sounded so good.